January. Now, if you overlook the fact that they don't understand the meaning of significant figures, if you round that off and say it's roughly 650 years, that's a reasonable number. But that's at present rates of consumption, meaning zero growth. But the whole point of the article that went with this was that we have to have rapid growth in our rate of consumption of coal. Now, it's pretty obvious, isn't it? If you have rapid growth in the rate of consumption, it won't last as long as it would last with zero growth. I wrote them a long letter. I pointed out that I thought this was a serious misrepresentation to give the readers the feeling we can have all the growth that's the subject of the article and still have coal around for 650 years. Well, you know, I got back a nice form letter that had nothing to do with what I'd tried to explain to them. I gave this talk in a high school in Omaha, and after the talk, the high school physics teacher came to me, and he had a booklet. He said, "Have you seen this?" And I hadn't seen it. He said, "Look at this. We've got coal coming out of our ears." As reported by Forbes magazine, now that's a prominent business magazine, the United States has 437 billion tons of known coal reserves. That's a good number. This is equivalent to a lot of BTUs, or it's enough energy to keep 100 million large electric generating plants going for the next 800 years or so. Well, the teacher said to me, "How could that be true? That's one large electric generating plant for every 2 people in the United States." And I said, "Of course it can't be true. It's absolutely crazy. Let's do long division to see how crazy it is." So you take the coal they say is there, divide by what was then the current rate of consumption, you get 670 years. We couldn't keep that rate of consumption up for 800 years. We hardly have 500 large electric generating plants. They said it would be good for 100 million such plants. Time magazine observed that certainly the coal is there beneath the pitheads of Appalachia and the Ohio Valley, and under the sprawling strip mines of the West. Lie coal seems rich enough to meet the country's power needs for centuries, no matter how much energy consumption may grow. And so I give you a very fundamental observation. Don't believe any prediction of the life expectancy of a non-renewable resource until you have confirmed the prediction by repeating the calculation. And as a corollary, we have to note that the more optimistic the prediction, the greater is the probability that it's based on faulty arithmetic or on no arithmetic at all. Again, from Time magazine, we read that energy industries agree that to achieve some form of energy self-sufficiency, the U.S. must mine all of the coal that it can. Now think about that for just a moment. Let me paraphrase it. The more rapidly we consume our resources, the more self-sufficient we'll be. Isn't that what it says? David Brower calls this the policy of strength through exhaustion. Now here's an example of strength through exhaustion. Here is William Simon, energy advisor to the President of the United States. And Simon says we should be trying to get as many holes drilled as possible to get the proven oil reserves. The more rapidly we can get the rest of that oil up out of the ground and finish using it, the better off we'll be. So let's look at the rate at which we have been able to take petroleum from the ground in the United States. Again, from the work of the late Dr. M. King Hubbard, we have here a semi-logarithmic plot. You can see that the line's been straight for quite a while, average growth rate around 8% per year. But for some time now, the rate of extraction has fallen way below the growth curve while our demand continued on up that curve. Now, it's obvious that the difference between those two curves has to be made up with imports. And it was back in 1976 that we read that for the first month in the nation's history, we had to import more oil than we were able to take from our ground ourselves. Now, with the big price increases from OPEC, that fraction fell back below 50%. But in early 1990, we read that oil imports hit an all-time high of 54% of our nation's petroleum consumption in January of 1990. So we're back up on the growth curve. Now, maybe you're wondering if it makes any sense to imagine that we could have steady growth in the consumption of a resource till the last bit of it was used, and then the rate of consumption would plunge abruptly to zero. And I say, no, that does not make sense. And you say, well, then why bother us with the calculation of this expiration time? My answer is this. Every segment of our society, our business leaders, government leaders, industrial leaders, political leaders at the local, state, and national level, everyone aspires to maintain a society in which all measures of material consumption continue to grow steadily year after year after year, world without end. Now, since that is so central to everything we do, we ought to know where it would lead. On the other hand, we should recognize that there is a better model. The late Dr. Hubbard studied the rate of consumption of resources that have already expired. He found, yes, there is an early period of steady growth in the rate of consumption, but then the rate goes through a maximum and comes back down in a nice symmetric bell-shaped curve. And when he fits that curve to the data on U.S. oil consumption, he finds that today we're right here. We've used more than half of the recoverable oil that was ever in the ground in the United States. Now, that's roughly what that Texas expert said. Now let's see what it means. It means that from now on, the rate of extraction of oil from the ground in the United States can only go steadily downhill, and it's downhill all the rest of the way, and it doesn't matter what they say inside the Beltway in Washington, D.C. Now, it means we could work hard and put bumps on the downhill side of the curve. You'll see there are bumps on the uphill side. The debate continues over drilling in the Arctic Wildlife Refuge. The largest number I've seen is an estimate for the oil they might find there is 3.2 billion barrels. Well, 3.2 billion barrels is the area of this tiny square. It's less than 1 year's consumption in the United States, and that's what all the debate is about. So let's look at the curve in this way. Area under the curve represents a quantity of the resource. So the total area under the total curve, that's the size of the total resource before any of it was used. We've divided that here into three parts. Unshaded on the left, that's the oil we've taken from the ground. We've used it, it's gone. The narrow blue shaded vertical band here, that's the oil we've drilled into, we've found it, we've counted it, we're pumping on it today. Shaded in green on the right, that is the undiscovered oil. We now know how much oil remains undiscovered in the United States. This is the oil we're looking for in all the places where drilling is going on. This is the oil we've got to find if we're going to make it down the curve on schedule. Now, it's very important to note, as people often remind me, that back around the turn of the century, somebody predicted that we would be out of oil in the United States in 25 years. We obviously were not. That calculation must have been wrong. Therefore, some people conclude calculations are wrong. Let's see what happened. Back at the turn of the century, that narrow blue-shaded vertical band was way over here on the left. All they did then was to take the amount of oil they knew about, they had discovered, divided by how rapidly it was being used, and come up with 25 years. Now, that calculation has to be redone every time you make a new discovery. Today, we're not talking just about the oil we know about. We're talking about the oil we've discovered, plus oil we have not discovered. We are now talking about the rest of the oil. And so maybe you're wondering, why didn't somebody tell us this? Well, it was back in 1956 that Dr. Hubbard addressed a convention of petroleum geologists and engineers. He told them that his analysis led him to the conclusion that the peaks that you just saw of U.S. oil and gas production could be expected to occur between 1966 and 1971, and no one took him seriously. So let's see what's happened. Here we have a graph showing millions of barrels of oil a day taken from the ground in the United States as a function of time. It was back here in 1956 that Dr. Hubbard did his analysis. He said then that this rate of extraction would reach a peak between 1966 and 1971. Well, you can see the peak was reached in 1970. It was followed by a very rapid decline, a slow recovery, and then a very rapid decline down the right-hand side of the curve. The left side of this curve is oil taken from the ground in the lower 48 states. If you continue the points for that oil, it is continuing right on down like this, and this bump, this recovery and fall, that's the Alaska pipeline that had a peak here sometime in the mid-1980s. And so you can sort of see here the peak of the Hubbard curve for the total 50 states. And if you do, as two of my colleagues in physics have done, stand back and look at the whole Hubbard curve, you see here the little tiny dots. Those represent the rates of extraction. There is the peak in 1970. There's the peak from the Alaska pipeline. And now we're falling very rapidly down the right-hand side of that curve, just as Dr. Hubbard projected. The Geological Survey in 1984 told us that the estimated U.S. supply from undiscovered resources, that area on the right side of that earlier graph, and demonstrated reserves that we know about, was 36 years at present rates of production, or 19 years in the absence of imports. The survey later, in 1989, tells us that the 36 years is down to 32 years, and the 19 years is down to 16 years. The numbers are holding together as we march down the right-hand side of the Hubbard curve. Now, in October of 1993, the news reports told of the largest oil discovery in the Gulf of Mexico in 20 years, 700 million barrels of oil. How long would that last in the United States? Do the long division, 42 days worth of consumption in the United States. Let's look at the global situation. In 1972, Dr. Hubbard made this projection of the global rate of extraction of oil. He predicted that the maximum rate of extraction would be reached before the year 2000. I have talked with geologists, and they think it's going to be a little bit later than Dr. Hubbard had projected. They think the latest it could possibly be is the year 2020, but most likely it'll be before the year 2010. Here we see a graph of the actual consumption of oil on a global scale. You can see the early period curves up. That's a period of steady growth that we had for over 100 years. You can see the first oil price shock and the second oil price shock as OPEC raised their oil prices. When you look at this curve, you cannot tell for sure whether we have yet reached the maximum or where the maximum will likely be. It's interesting to look at what's reported here in one of the world oil journals. They tell us that genuine new discoveries of oil over the past decade, which is from 1984 to 1994, has averaged 8.6 billion barrels a year compared to consumption of almost 26 billion barrels a year, consumption running 3 times the rate of discovery. But compare that now with what we read in Popular Science in October of '93. They say that instead the discoveries of petroleum reserves continued to outstrip increases in demand, keeping prices low. Exactly the opposite in these two presentations. Only one of them can be correct. Now here we have a story that an oil executive says that an oil supply will last for 50 years. You have to look through that entire article. You don't find any numbers that you can use in doing arithmetic to see whether he means at present rates of consumption or with the growth of consumption rates that we're experiencing. It's an incredibly brief article that doesn't give us any real information. And Dr. Hubbard addressed a committee of the Congress. He told them that the exponential phase of the industrial growth, which has dominated human activities during the last couple of centuries, is now drawing to a close. Yet during the last 2 centuries of unbroken industrial growth, we have evolved what amounts to an exponential growth culture. Well, I would say it's more than a culture. It's our national religion. We worship growth. Pick up any newspaper, you'll see stories such as this: state forecast robust growth. Have you ever heard of a physician diagnosing a cancer in a patient and telling the patient you have a robust cancer? Here is a local business firm. Their third quarter orders are disappointing, and an official says that anything under the 40 to 50% growth rate would be disappointing to us. Now, how much do you have to know to realize you couldn't have 40 to 50% growth rate of anything real for very long, and if you're counting on it, it is absolutely guaranteed in advance that you're going to be disappointed. Yet I'll bet this guy's got a college degree. IBM's in trouble because they invested heavily in new building equipment and employees in the belief that their revenues would keep growing. You don't need a computer to do this kind of arithmetic. While Americans were being killed in the Gulf War, The Economist tells us that the Gulf situation may hurt Colorado's growth. We worship growth. It's the most important thing in our entire society. And we see at the national level the promise of more growth. But it isn't just a national phenomenon, it's an international phenomenon. In the Wall Street Journal, we read that the Japanese are so accustomed to growth that economists in Tokyo